Let's get started. Welcome, everyone. It's my pleasure to host this wonderful event on decolonizing conservation. I'm Caterina Scaramelli. I'm a research assistant professor in anthropology and earth and environment, and I will be the, I'll try to be in the screen so that Adrian can see me, your host and moderator for today. We have, I'm just putting up my notes about the speakers. So Federica Bocchi is a PhD candidate in the philosophy department here at BU. She's an expert in the philosophy of science and is working on a dissertation entitled Philosophy of Biodiversity, Issues in Measurement, Data, and Conservation, where she's investigating questions such as what it means to measure biodiversity as a complex phenomenon, and how conservation actions should stop perpetrating environmental injustices. And Federica, congratulations, will start a postdoc position at the University of Copenhagen in the fall. I'm very jealous, it's a beautiful campus. Federica will talk for about 30 minutes, and that will be followed by a response and a set of commentary for about 10-15 minutes by Adrian, who is a senior lecturer in the Department of Sociology, Philosophy, and Anthropology at Exeter, and is also interested in scientific methodology, especially in the historical sciences, perhaps related to the dinosaur collection you can see in the screen. He has published a book recently entitled Rock, Bone, and Ruin, An Optimist Guides to the Historic Sciences, and 2 other monographs, and is also the founder of the blog Extinct, which is about topics at the intersection of philosophy and paleontology. So without further ado, thank you all for being here, and we'll give the stage to Federica.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks everyone for being here. It's the first time I'm presenting these ideas in this way. I hope you will enjoy. This is part of one of my dissertation chapters, which is connected to the topic of decolonizing conservation, and I'm happy to get any feedback from you about the directions. So let me just share my screen first. Okay, so this is the topic of my talk, and it is divided in 2 parts. So I thought of this presentation as like an introduction to non-philosophers about decolonizing science in general. So the first part will be about like setting the stage for my discussion. I will talk about decolonizing conservation as a problem, and I will also address some of the solutions that philosophers of science have developed to address the colonization aspect of science. And I will be very abstract in this part. You can ask me more in the Q&A if you want. It's just as an introduction. It's in the second part where I will talk about, and I will delve deeper into my own area of expertise, which is conservation, biodiversity conservation. And here I will first introduce to you a project that has been approved in December 2022, and that is considered to be a form of green colonialism. And then I will discuss a couple of solutions to address this type of colonialism in conservation. One that is based on the rights, on affirming the rights of indigenous communities inhabiting certain areas, and my own solution, which instead focuses on the metrics that are being used in conservation science. Okay, let's talk about science as a colonial enterprise and decolonizing science. And I think we all tend to think of colonialism in terms of political, social, military terms. But actually, there are many scientific practices today that can be considered colonial. For example, take this item. These are objects called the Benin bronzes. This is a series of plaques in bronze and copper that have been developed by the people of the Odo ethnicity from the 13th century onward, and they have been acquired by the British troops during the Benin campaign in 1897. And these plaques were were around like 900 of them. They used to decorate the royal palace in Benin City, that today is in the south of Nigeria. And they depict scenes that relate to the social, to the community, to the social norms, to the military customs of the Benin state. And they have been used to ground scientific accounts of how culture and other practices have developed in Africa, in West Africa, especially from the Middle Ages onward. And do you know where these plaques are? Can you guess it?
One.
British Museum, correct. 200 of them are still at the British Museum. As you can see, this looks quite like a form of colonialism in science. Now, this is not the only way in which science can be colonial. There are many other ways in which scientific practices can be thought of in those terms. The first one, the first idea that we get, and that is pretty prevalent in the scientific community, especially in the literature that I am familiar with, is that there's this idea that science is mostly produced by the West in terms of Western institution and in terms of Western scientists. And I like the colonial theorist Achille Mbembe, who has recently called this a real canon, the idea that truth is usually in the hands of Westerners, and the way in which knowledge is produced tends to be highly skewed toward countries that are richer or that hold more economic resources. Colonialism in science only manifests itself in terms of scholarly inequalities. This can come in the form of funding, which are the institution and the association that are responsible for funding research. Normally, they are located in specific countries. It's less likely you're going to find them in developing countries. In terms of publication, Westerner scientists tend to publish more. The role in knowledge production, when local communities belonging to underdeveloped or to less developed countries are involved, for example, in fieldwork, they tend to do the fieldwork labor, but data are normally like sent to institutions in the global north, and this is where the data analysis happens. There's a lot of suppression of linguistic diversity, and like the literature in science is like increasingly focusing on this, the fact that if publications are not in English, they are less likely to take central stage or being considered. There are also derogatory expressions that are prevalent, especially in conservation science. Think about alien species, think about non-native species. Normally there's like a militarization of the language that is being used in certain sciences. Exploitation, this still happens, and it's a form of colonialism in science. Sometimes there are local experts, including both academics, but also indigenous communities that are being called in the process of knowledge production, but they are usually not recognized. So, for example, you would have farmers in Africa that are often asked to collect data about their own crops, but actually they're not then recognized in their publication. There's also the problem, we were talking about the Benin bronzes, of the displacement of valuable items. And my colleague here, Leticia, she's working on the topic and on the ethics of what's called parachute science, when like Westerner scientists tend to go to underdeveloped countries and exploit their resources without giving proper recognition. Last but not least, sometimes we have this exploitation of resources without considering the local expertise, the local knowledge, or the tradition, and how much certain items might be of value to the local communities that are being deprived of those items. So the landscape of the problem should be clear by now. And what have philosophers of science said so far? Actually, philosophy has not developed much attention toward the colonial aspect of science, but they have focused a lot on marginalization. And philosophers of science have tackled the problem of how marginalization of certain communities have a negative epistemic impact on science, how science is not done properly if some certain communities are marginalized. And philosophers have developed some very interesting conceptual and practical tools to understand minoritization in science. For example, a lot of philosophers are today tackling the notion of objectivity and making clear how it, from the point of like asking a research question to the choice of methodology, all these enterprises are extremely value laden. And so it's better to make clear which values are going into your science in order to make sure that we also agree with those values. Several philosophers have advocated for diversity in science. There's a lot of studies also published in prominent journals that have shown the impact that non-diverse community have on the proper knowledge that is being produced. And we have several accounts of how including more people and more viewpoints to solve a specific science problem is increased if the community that is tackling that problem is diverse. Philosophers have also talked about democratizing science, especially since we have recognized that there are so many values involved in our scientific enterprises. Why do not put those values under the scrutiny of democracy? Finally, and this might be of interest to Adrian, since he is originally from New Zealand, some philosophers have talked about how we should rethink what counts as scientific knowledge in terms of more, or of not just the production or the application of a certain methodology, but also the social aspects. And they have started thinking that maybe some form of indigenous knowledge, for example, Matauranga Maori, might be considered as like at the same extent that we take scientific knowledge today. So I hope I have convinced you so far with this like very quick introduction that science can still operate according to a colonial paradigm. And I hope you agree this is not quite right. Now, let us talk about biodiversity conservation and in what sense you can have colonialism in this. And when I talk about biodiversity conservation, I'm especially talking about trying to avoid the extinction of species or trying to protect certain ecosystem from reaching the imbalances. Okay, I want to talk to you briefly about this book that has been published in 2016 by the famous Pulitzer Prize winner and Harvard entomologist E.O. Wilson, that's called Half Earth. And in this book, Wilson proposes that half of the Earth's surface should be designated as a human-free reserve in order to protect biodiversity. And consider that today around 15% of the land surface is under legal protection and only 7% of the ocean is. Wilson's plea for putting 50% of the Earth under protection has not gone unheard. And especially in December 2022 at COP15, which is parallel of COP27, but for biodiversity, the parties involved in the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is this treaty first signed in 1992, they have reconvened after a while to assess the goals that they have been reaching in the past 30 years. And they have decided to sign a new treaty that's called, in broad terms, the post-2020 framework for biological diversity, that now is being called the Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, in which they set new goals for what the United Nations should do in order to protect biodiversity, to avoid species loss, and to avoid ecosystem degradation. And one of their main target has come to be known as the 30 by 30 project. And let's just me read it as it's phrased in Target 3. They want to make sure that by 2030, at least 30% of terrestrial, inland water, and coastal and marine areas, especially area of particular importance for biodiversity and ecosystem function and service, are effectively conserved. So there's this idea that by 2030, we need to put 30% of our planet under protection. And why this like 30% by 2030? That's how did they make it up? No, if you visit the IUCN website, the CBD website, the website of the global organizations involved in this project, they rely on scientific expertise. They say that the threshold of 30% by 2030 is supported by strong scientific evidence. For example, here is probably the most quoted paper, the Dinerstein et al., in which they provide a model in which they explain why protecting minimally 30% of land and the sea is going to be critical in order to minimize or to tackle also the problem of climate change. Okay, now we have agreed that we need to protect 30% of our planet, but where exactly, like which area should be put under protection? And in 2020, following the Dinerstein and al. Plead, this environmental scientist, Bernardo Strasberg, and a lot of his colleagues have conducted a study to identify which areas of the planet should be prioritized for conservation. Basically, where we should establish protected areas. And they have applied 3 criteria. The first criterion was to avoid species extinction, which is one of the critical goals of conservation. The second criterion is the mitigation of climate change. And clearly, cost optimization. We cannot try to, it's useless to say that we need to protect an area without making a cost-benefit analysis according to scientists as well. And what they argue is that the success of this conservation is more likely achieved if we prioritize areas where the red spots are. So take a look at that. At that area, more or less. It's closer to the equator, clearly. And what do we mean by a protected area? We mean like a land where the human impact is either totally absent or is extremely limited. Now, by looking at the map, you might say like, okay, let's protect 30% of our planet, and let's prioritize the protection of the areas in the red part. Now, you might ask like, wait a minute, but aren't people living there? What's going to happen? So both philosophers and especially activists for the right of indigenous populations have complained that projects like the 30 by 30 look a lot like a form of fortress conservation. Fortress conservation is a management strategy that has been invented in the US and then has been exported to Africa and to the Asian colonies, in which population living in a certain area are being evicted in order for that area to remain pristine, to remain intact. And this form of fortress conservation model seems to be at the basis of this 30 by 30 project. A clear example of fortress conservation are the establishment of national parks, especially you might think about the Yellowstone National Park or in South Africa. They have a long history of fortress conservation where you grab a land, you want to protect it, but in order to do so, you have to exclude and to remove the people who are living there. Now, as I said, fortress conservation has been practiced for a long time in the US, in Southern Asia, in Africa, and has resulted in this phenomenon of eviction of indigenous communities whose voices are not usually heard. And Mark Dowie has conducted a very good inquiry, in my opinion, and has published this book calling that phenomenon the phenomenon of the creation of conservation refugees. And here I have added some numbers just to give you an idea of the magnitude of the problem worldwide. Just take the first bullet point. It looks like, this is not like a Dowie statistic, but it's a Geisler and the social statistics, it looks like in Africa, just because of conservation prioritization, between 900,000 and 14 million people have been evicted from their native lands. This is just like one of the many statistics that you can find. You can visit, for example, conservation, a lot of cultural, let me say it again. You can visit, for example, websites of associations that work close to indigenous communities to find better accounts and better statistics. And of course, you might think that the phenomenon of eviction for conservation, you can clearly see that generates other harms in terms of homelessness, marginalization of community, loss of tradition, also food insecurity for those communities that rely a lot on subsistence hunting, exposition to diseases, forced assimilation into other communities. This is a lot of harm. And I see, therefore, conservation operating as a colonial practice here, at least along two axes. The first, according to my interpretation, there's a sense in which colonialism acts as a form of material appropriation, where you have communities that have been traditionally living in an area that see a reduction or of their accessibility to the resources. Or this population are sometimes evicted from their traditional lands and relocated, for example, in refugee camps. And also there's a sort of like moralization about which activities are allowed in protected areas, that, for example, scientific expeditions and ecotourism are legitimate activities to do in protected areas, whereas subsistence hunting is just like, no, not morally permissible. But I also see colonialism operating as a sort of imposition of a scientific worldview onto other communities, especially in the form of like these international organizations considering themselves the only experts, the only one in charge of giving guidelines about how to handle nature and protected area. And this, like, there's a clear demarcation here in project like 30 by 30, in which like you clearly set some goals about what counts as sustainable exploitation of certain areas. There's a lot of rhetoric going on here, and we can talk about it later. And also, one of the issues that I see is this mythization, creating the myth of wilderness, the idea that we need to keep pristine areas in order for nature to run its course. And this is an imposition of a scientific worldview, because like there are indigenous communities who do not own the concept of wilderness at all. So yeah, conservation can be a form of colonialism, in my opinion. And of course, some questions arise out of this. The first one is like, how can we say that conservation actions like establishing protected areas be successful if it creates so much harm to especially minoritized group, indigenous and traditional communities? Shall conservation disregard entirely the well-being of indigenous communities, or rather, is there a way to develop better science which is also equitable? I'm going to talk about two solutions very briefly. The first one is a solution that has been recommended by many NGOs, and it consists in answering the question of how to attain conservation goal while being sensitive to the issues of the problem of displacement. And the first solution is advocating for a trade-off between, on the one hand, the protection of biodiversity, avoiding species extinction, etc. And on the other hand, the legal rights of indigenous communities. So for example, here is a 2010 project that was sponsored by both the UNESCO and the Convention on Biological Diversity, about how to operate this trade-off between nature on the one hand and human rights on the other. And normally these types of solution finding a trade-off are very popular, and they come in the form of community-based conservation. So the idea is that the scientists would go to a hotspot, a biodiversity hotspot, as we want to call it today, and they would like establish, sometimes also with the help of local community, which are the priorities there, how to do conservation, which are the rules, and they would give money or resources to the community to operate as stewards of that land. And so the success of a conservation action here is basically a good balance between nature protection and respecting the rights of indigenous communities on the other hand. And when conflict emerges in these scenarios, what happens is that normally instead of having the scientific expert decide where to go, if there's some conflict, this needs to be decided. This needs to be solved in the community and considered at large, not just by the scientific expert. And in case relocation seems to be the only option for protecting a hotspot or saving a species, this has to be voluntary. There are clearly this is clearly a very good solution under many respects. For example, international conservation NGOs already support community-based conservation. So you don't have to convince them. They already know that. I mean, at least in their statute, they say that. There are also pragmatic considerations because conservationists have understood that without the help of the local community living in biodiversity hotspots, there's no way you're gonna have a successful conservation. And also there's a sort of celebration of the expertise of local communities, which is not necessarily like the traditional form of academic expertise that we value. And this strategy also looked like a form of empowerment and self-determination of indigenous communities in front of like this global crisis. But there are a lot of cons, I think, in this model. And especially if we're talking about like, if the trade-off has to be between nature protection and the legal rights of indigenous communities, the problem is that some indigenous communities are not legally recognized as such. So there's a procedure to go through to get full recognition. And if you, as community, fail to get that, it looks like this strategy does not apply to you and you can be evicted. But there are other issues which have more to do with the scientific assumptions that are involved in this model. For example, I have some issue with this idea that the goal of conservation itself should be just having a people-free landscape. So this is the ultimate desideratum of conservation. I find it quite problematic. Also, the affirmation of the myth of wilderness, the idea that nature does better on its own, and the human impact is nothing but detrimental to wilderness. I think there's also a reliance on the famous nature-culture divide. If we say that there must be a trade-off between nature and humans, there's a sense in which we see a clear separation between the two. And this might also be considered problematic under many respects, and we can talk about it. And also, the last point I want to make is that when you think about biodiversity conservation under this model, you would have the way in which you operationalize biodiversity has only to do with phenomena, for example, species and ecosystem that are not humans. So you exclude all the practices and the phenomena that emerge out of cultural activity. For example, biocultural diversity or ethnic diversities are not right operationalization of biodiversity in this model. So I think it's good to talk about trade-offs between nature protection and conservation, but my approach is slightly different. And since my dissertation is about measurements, I want to introduce you to a field of philosophy, not philosophy, but an interdisciplinary field that might guide us toward finding a different solution to the problem of displacement. And I want to talk briefly about critical metrology. So critical means like critical analysis. Metrology is about the measurement practices. And this is a phrase that has been coined by philosopher Marion Bullicolt. And the general idea is to make a critical analysis about the measurement practices themselves. Here is the term metrology. And unlike you might think prima facie, measurement practices are not neutral at all. They tend to bring about certain values. Think about the GDP measures, which tend to exclude productive services like food preparation, cleaning, that are normally performed in many countries by a minoritized group, right? This is quite the example for critical metrology, I think. And as I see it, the goal of critical metrology is the following, is to show that the measurement practices contribute most of the time to not the scientific, but also to the political status quo, which is discriminatory toward certain minorities. And the idea, what we philosophers, but not only, need to do is disclose and dismantle the assumptions that ground the way in which metrics are produced. And finally, we also have a normative goal, which is to offer some recommendation to help understand how to address this issue and move further to do better science, which is at the same time more equitable. And applying critical metrology in conservation, I think it can be done according to three aspects. I have an ethical aspect. I want to show that traditional performance metrics, success metrics in conservation, the metrics that are used to assess and predict whether an action can be successful, tend to generate injustices like the type of eviction we were talking earlier. But there's an epistemic aspect underlying the ethical one, is that the performance metrics that are today applied in conservation tend to disregard scientific evidence, and I'm going to talk about this in a second. But I also want to provide like some guidance. I want to provide like an agenda on how to generate better performance metrics that are also more just and fair. So let me just say, like, how are conservation actions measured so far? So traditional metrics are about metrics in which you have certain biotic and abiotic factor. For example, you might think that a successful conservation strategy is the one that has been able to bring a population back to its original carrying capacity. Think about, for example, like bringing back 5,000 elephant in an area that has been subject to culling or poaching. This is a type of biotic factor that is normally factored in metrics performance metrics in conservation. For example, here I have put some examples like changes in the amount of targeted conserved species or the total area conserved. If you meet these criteria, you have a successful strategy. But not only that, sometimes there are abiotic parameters that are used to define whether a conservation strategy has been successful or not. The first one might be the mitigation of climate change. So if your conservation strategy has also brought about some sort of mitigation, that's successful. But also if it has some like, if the cost benefit analysis also has shown that your conservation action was worth it. So we also have these economic values that are brought into the metrics in conservation. And I think this is all good, but it reveals some problematic assumptions in traditional metrics. The first one, as I have already mentioned, is that cultural and ethnic diversity are not valuable to conservation. They should not be factored in the metrics themselves. The idea of wilderness, we only focus about like maintaining certain environmental parameters, hopefully excluding humans. And this idea of wilderness, the problem is that it excludes that many areas of the world, probably everywhere, have been highly manipulated by humans in the past. maybe not in the form Western thinkers would expect, but for sure they have been manipulated. And so my solution here, and I'm running out of time, so I'll just like try to wrap up fast. What I want to say in the written version of the paper, the direction my project is taking, is that I want to say that metrics in conservation should bring humans in terms of human well-being, in terms of socioeconomic factor, and in terms of cultural diversity. And I think that by bringing people in all these respects, the metrics that we have epistemic advantage. So they are better metrics. They are not just more fair. They are like scientifically better. And the reason is that metrics that bring in all this factor do not have the problematic assumptions that I was mentioning in the previous slide. For example, if you bring people in, it seems like you're not endorsing the myth of wilderness, as we were talking about earlier. And you are not disregarding the fact that the landscape that we really value are a co-production of humans and the environment. And finally, what you demonstrate is that cultural and ethnic diversities are reasonable operationalization of the concept of biodiversity, which is the topic of biodiversity conservation. So in the written version of the paper, I also go over an example in the Congo Basin ecoregion, in which an analysis has been done using different metrics, traditional metrics, and metrics that factor in socio-cultural aspects. And it has been, and this is a case study from 2018 by Jessica Gruber. And I'm not asking you to read it because I don't have time. But the idea is that if you compare, if you assess a preserved area according to two different sets of metrics, one, the traditional one, which only considers biotic and abiotic factors, you might have an area that is considered to be highly successful in terms of conservation. But if you include other parameters, for example, sociocultural factors or human well-being, those same areas result highly unsuccessful in terms of conservation. And so I have an anti-colonial agenda for conservation that I want to bring up in my paper and in my project. I want to say that when we want to perform decolonization, especially in conservation science, we have to rethink how measurements are conceptualized and performed. And I want to argue that cultural and ethnic diversity should be included within biodiversity science as real object of conservation, given by this like reconceptualization also of what biodiversity is and what protection should include. And I want to also argue that success of a conservation action should not exclude indigenous community and especially their well-being. I also want to briefly argue that there's no way in which you have to the same measure that's going to work in all circumstances. So you have to go local in that sense. This is just to sum up. As I said, the 30 by 30 project seems to run the risk of being a form of green colonialism. I have shown that there are community-based conservation models that fall short of some epistemic criteria that we have. I have also shown how critical metrology is an approach that tackles the same issue, but instead of using focusing on the trade-off between nature and human rights, also rethinks how measurements themselves are being conceptualized and applied. And I ended up with my anti-colonial agenda for conservation, even if very quickly. I want to say thank you a lot for listening to my project. I welcome any feedback. Here I have also put like some resources in case you're interested, and all the references are there. And thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for this really thorough and clear presentation. We are going to hear Professor Currie offer some commentary remarks, and then we're going to open it up for conversation and discussions amongst ourselves too. Adrian,
thank you.
I'm
hearable.
projected. Yeah, you're hearable and you're being projected on a large, but not too large screen.
Yep, I hope you all enjoy my giant head. Yeah, so thanks, Federica. That was really, really interesting. I think the main crux of what I'm going to be poking at is there was a point where you said that you thought your view was slightly different to the view you were discussing. And perhaps that was false modesty. I think that actually it's potentially extremely different. And I see a sort of soft version of your claim and a hard version of your claim. And I'm going to sort of try and bring out these differences. And I think as it were, the hard version is more in line with the kind of goals that I see decolonialization as having. So I'm going to start just by talking a little bit about sort of how I understand sort of decolonial projects. What I'm then going to do is go and talk a little bit about how I'm conceiving of sort of Federica's project. And then I'm going to draw out some like possible, interesting, uncomfortable upshots from it. So first off, in many ways, my capacity to talk about this stuff is wildly limited. As Federica mentioned, I'm a sort of Pakeha New Zealander, which is to say a white European raised in New Zealand. I'm a benefitor of sort of colonial structures and so on and so forth, which means I've got pretty limited insights into the situational lived experiences of many of the people, or all of the people, frankly, who hit the bad side of these sort of colonial practices. But I'm going to do the best I can with the kind of philosophical resources I have. So I take it at base, decolonial practice is interested in disrupting and changing certain structures which are, as it were, legacies of colonialism, right? They're various forms of material, political, moral, spiritual, and epistemic injustices, particularly centered around forms of exploitation. One way of thinking about this is there's this kind of problem where the sort of decisions about sort of what to value, how to conceive of value, what policies to enact those values, right? What kind of positions might be on the table are kind of taken to be from a particular perspective, that perspective being the sort of colonial one. And that's taken as either your sort of default, your kind of assumption, or at least as the kind of neutral perspective. So I might be taking other perspectives on the table, but it's their difference from the colonial one, which is sort of how they're framed. And so the idea of decolonization is to completely decenter that, right? It's not to get rid of colonial voices, but rather to make colonial voices simply just one of many, is one way of thinking about it. And we need to be, I think, kind of careful about how substantive this claim is, because I think it's sort of very substantive. So I take kind of seriously worries that people like Tuck and Yang have raised about the way in which decolonial talk can become a kind of sort of form of sort of whitewashing, right? So they complain that more sort of metaphorical notions of decolonialization lead to, quote, a set of evasions or settler moves to innocence that problematically attempts to reconcile settler guilt to complicity and rescue settler futurity. So decolonialization can be a process that itself reinforces settler power if it is merely sort of a metaphorical or unsubstantive thing. So what does it mean for it to be substantive? Essentially, for me, the thing for being substantive is really about ceding of control in various ways. I think Carl White captures this very nicely. So here's a quote from one of his papers. He says, while apologies and forgiveness have symbolic value, Indigenous peoples are demanding reclamation of Indigenous lands and waters and recognition of Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination on those lands and waters. Now, what White calls Indigenous environmental studies and science, he thinks that this sort of new, I don't know if you call it institution, but set of practices, sheds light on how reclamation and sovereignty entail the capacity of Indigenous peoples to rebuild and continue complex moral relationships that can promote economic, cultural, and social resilience for the sake of future generations' well-being. So the thought here is something like, look, it's actually about ceding control in various ways over to Indigenous people that itself is going to forward various types of aims of conservation and kind of ecology and so on and so forth. And note that this isn't simply a matter of kind of including individuals from these groups into existing power structures, right? The idea isn't just that I just you know, have a couple of people from local indigenous communities on my board or something like this, right? The idea is that sort of settler perspectives are so built into power structures that it's the power structures themselves that need to change. So Alison Wiley, I'm going to stop quoting people in a second, but Alison Wiley puts this like very sort of strongly, I think, in a sort of recent paper. She says, the institutional and economic conditions, she's talking about archaeology, under which archaeology is practiced, enforce complicity with the eliminativist agendas of settler colonial regimes. What that means is the erasure of sort of non-settler perspectives and the economic imperatives of late-stage capitalism, so it fits within that set of incentives. This complicity is perpetuated by self-delusion and complacency, deliberate misrepresentation, and evasion. So that's a very strong way of putting the sort of challenge here. It's the structures that got to be changed, not simply, as it were, repopulated. So I take it then crucial to a true decolonial practice is the ceding of colonial control. And that ceding is not just to material conditions, but also to epistemic social conditions and practices. And to that, issues of sovereignty and autonomy are central. Now, again, this doesn't mean that opinions of people like me, colonial as no doubt they are, aren't worth anything, right? But rather, they should simply be sort of one voice in a conversation, and indeed one that should probably sort of shut up already. And so what we're kind of interested in finding is what kind of resources can we use to shut me up, right? And one of the things I find really interesting about Federica's appeal to critical metrology, and more generally to what I take to be resources from the philosophy of measurement, is this really helps us get a handle on how philosophy could help us give us those resources. So really quickly, I take it that Federica is comparing two ways that we might try and cede some power, as it were, to indigenous communities in the context of conservation. The first is a kind of divide and conquer strategy. We say, okay, well, we've got biodiversity value on the one hand, and we've got this other stuff. We've got, you know, cultural values on the other hand. These are conflicting in various contexts. We have to find a way of sort of muddling through it. Part of the solution here is granting what I might call implementation decisions to indigenous groups. So they're in charge of like the details of how to actually protect stuff, but what the values in fact are, how we're conceiving of success and so forth, is still wildly sort of colonial, as Federica nicely put. It's very familiar to people who have paid any attention to environmental philosophy. You know, the separation between humans and the environment and so on and so forth are very common themes. I take it that critical metrology, by the other hand, is starting off with like a very, very kind of, let's say, intro thing from the philosophy of measurement, which is just that measurement structures, measurement schema are not theoretically innocent, right? Measurements are things that humans construct for human aims and involve a large number of decisions that humans make. And so you can think about measurements in a sense as encoding a set of values, right? You show me how you're measuring something and I'll tell you what you're valuing, right? And so biodiversity map values are, of course, encoding a bunch of those things, right? Now, I said that I thought there was a weak and strong version of Federica's claim. I take it the weak version of the claim just says, we've got our accounts of what cultural biodiversity might be, or some account of human flourishing. We're going to find a way of integrating that. But I take it, if I'm right, that the way we should think about this is about decolonization as ceding control, then it's not so much about just combining these two kinds of measurement. It's rather about being in dialogue with local people, local communities, about what they in fact value and the measurements arising from that. So they have power not simply in implementation, but power in the structure, which in this case is the measurement, right? The measurement is the whole point of this critical metrology, is that measurement, in some, to put it very strongly, determines the outcome somehow. And so this idea seems to be local communities are involved deeply, have a loud voice in shaping what the measurements in fact are. They shape the metrics. I want to make a couple of quick points about this before I shut up, as I see it as the point here. First off, I think that there's going to be some pretty discomforting upshots of this. One is, it would be astonishing if there was some kind of metric that would work across contexts. And the reason for that is very, very simple. the people who were colonized are very, very different. And the colonizers are very, very different. And the legacy of colonization is very, very different. And in this wild variation, there's not going to be, I would think, sort of metrics that are going to capture different groups, right? Even one metric for a particular group, right? The extremely polysemous, right? And so I think we're going to have to bid goodbye to the kinds of easily commensurate general measurements that are favored by conservationists and are crucially important for trying to, measure success on a global scale, trying to argue to policymakers, and so on and so forth. Second, it's not clear to me that sort of having collaborative attempts or ceding sovereignty to measuring biodiversity or conservation goals generally is going to solve these kind of value clashes, right? Given the heterogeneity of the folks we're dealing with, there may just well be cases where we're still faced with relocation versus extinction, right? And I take it that one thing we do get from decolonization, at least to an extent, is, in those contexts, how we navigate those clashes is going to have to be much more bottom up, and it's going to be much more democratic than we might think. But I think we need to be open to the idea of conservation being transformed in these ways, right? There are going to be ways that I myself have trouble kind of handling, have trouble sort of conceiving of, but I take it that this is exactly the kind of discomfort that decolonization is supposed to bring with it, right? I take it it's sort of the discomfort of no longer being the default, right? So I think the ways in which I feel uneasy about this are the ways that I feel uneasy in the sense that I'm used to my perspective and my voice being taken as null, and I'm starting to feel it start to be just one in the mix, and that's extremely discomforting. So thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian, for your insights. I think you're definitely right. I think I should also have mentioned in my agenda, and I have not, that this is what I think this is more like what would follow from the critical metrology approach, and it's not an assumption. Is the idea that when you establish a metrics itself, you cannot do it like from the point of view of a large global NGO like the IUCN, but you should rather like build up metrics from the bottom up, especially like relying on indigenous communities. And I had some pushback once about the fact that whether talking about metrics at all is not already a form of colonialism. I think it is not, because it's like metrics have been used since forever by local communities, and there are like quite a lot of accounts about how people measure the calendar or whatever. So I think like there's a sense in which we can conceive of measurement in terms that are broad enough as to be able to manipulate metrics from different perspectives while still be talking about the same things, if that makes sense. And I like what you said about like the discomfort. I think there is going to be a lot of discomfort if I follow up with my project until the end, because that would like mean that finding standardized metrics to assess conservation success cannot be done on scientific papers, probably like the one the Dinerstein et al. Or the Strasbourg et al., but need to be done in a way such that it's not legitimized only if it gets published. I think this is another of the implication that might be extremely discomforting to traditional conservationists.
All right, thank you so much, Adrian and Elizabeth, for your response to the response. I do research on the history of conservation of wetlands, and I just wanted to bring you to mind one of the archival sources. I do mostly ethnography, but also a little bit of archival source. There was a report from an ornithology expedition to Turkey in the 1970s, a group of Cambridge University scientists complaining that the report author complained that it was impossible to find a birdie spot free of Turks, Turkish people everywhere. the report was coded in sand. So many political ecologists have written about the long history of fortress conservation and have offered qualitative nuanced analysis of what happens in specific contexts where participation models are being implemented. This is a style of conservation that rose in the 1990s, and some of the kind of case specific gains and losses. And so there is so much to talk about here. I just wanted to say this was an excellent presentation, and I'm sure the discussion will be really lively. I'm going to see raise hands. I'm going to write down your names and let you speak in order. So I apologize, I don't know your name, so maybe you could briefly introduce yourselves too.
My name is Rich Rosen. I'm a local resident of Brooklyn. I'm retired, but I've been a philosophy of science graduate student in the distant past, and I've been a scientist, and I'm sort of an expert on climate change broadly. I think your presentation was great, but, and there's a big but coming, let's assume we agree with everything you say. It's all very sensible to me, at least in general. But then the question is, what is our main goal here? If our main goal is talking about extinction of species, then I think the big problem is far exceeds all the, what I'd call the micro problems that you described. Okay, because what you described was mostly focused to me on how one might deal with conservation at a fairly local level, right? But, you know, could be a few hundred square kilometers or whatever, but you know, like your little red areas. But the problem with extinction is much broader, right? It's the whole world, and it's all the species, and we already have reports that huge fractions, right, of species have already become extinct. Are they in danger? And of course, what's the reason? Number one, we have too many people in the world. So this is a big concern that you didn't mention. And I think it's really important, because if you want to, even if you're talking hypothetically that maybe we should have regions of the world that don't have people, you know, how do you do that? Because there are too many people. Number two, with climate change, right, a major factor in leading to extinction of species in general, including humans now, is climate change. Okay, that's not local. What's local is the details of what changes in the climate. So this idea of 30 by 30, I think, is ridiculous. Okay, number one, it's not going to happen, and number two, it wouldn't stop climate change. And we have almost no effect of climate change if you know the relationship between how we deal with biomass and species and climate CO2, and that, right, almost no effect. It reminds me of the, you know, the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals that we established in 2015, you know, with all these nice promises to people. None of that's happening, right? There's no commitment to making it happen. It's not going to happen, etc. So it's a similar thing with 30 by 30. I would think it would be important, in addition to all the great things you've said that are more local, to also deal with these global issues. Okay. With the economy we have, right, part of the climate change problem is obviously the type of the economy we have, right, the industrial aspects in particular, right? We can't control climate. I mean, again, I'm one of the world's strongest advocates in dealing with climate change, right? But the point is that it's not happening, right? And so this is just another kind of thing with 30 by 30 that's overpromised and not going to happen, and wouldn't have the effect we would like anyway. So, you know, I think it would be great in your work if you could sort of separate the issues of how do you establish the decolonization of local conservation projects. But right now, frankly, personally, I'm more interested in how we deal with extinction at the global level. And I think there's some, you know, unfortunately, there's somewhat separate and separable in terms of the philosophical analysis of how we deal, you know, with each. So that's my big but.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for, let me say, I agree with you that the 30 by 30 framework is not, like the 30 by 30 like goal is not gonna happen. I think this is the only thing I agree with you. The first thing I want to say is that I think it's victim blaming to say that the issue of extinction is because of population growth, and the problem of like climate change is because of population growth. I think this is not, this is victim blaming, especially because we know that the more populous countries are those who are also developing countries. And it feels like, I mean, an American, like the fridge of an American consumes as like 700 people in for a year in China or something. Like, I think it's more like, if we think about in terms of like individual footprint instead of like population growth, I think the balance of who's to blame for climate change shifts a little bit. And also, I think that thinking about global extinction, I mean, global extinctions are happening at the local level because the vast majority of the species that are getting extinct are those that have very limited areas to live, especially islands, etc. So I'm not really sure that talking about globality makes sense in terms of, in scientific terms. It makes sense in terms of political, in terms of politics, because we know that the vast majority of the funding that has been allocated to avoid extinction comes from Switzerland. So Switzerland and all the consultants that are based in Switzerland decide where the money goes. So in this sense, it's like a like it's in terms of global political distribution of resources that we should think about the topic of extinction. But also, one of the, I think, implication of my account and of my reflections more in general is that when we take species extinction to be a high priority, this is a high priority for whom? And especially if really there's a trade-off to be had between a species getting extinct and the thriving of a local community, cases in which eviction seems to be the only option. Like, who are we to decide that the species extinction counts higher in our priority than the well-being of a local community? For sure, the local community will not agree with you. And so I think there might be ways of making this process of establishing priorities more democratic. And the real global thing here is to adopt this mentality. I think this mentality should like be included in how everyone, like people who are involved in conservation, those who are subject of conservation measures, should conceive the role they are having in biodiversity conservation. I think this is the only global, the only real global aspect of my discourse. But thank you for your question.
Point I want to raise with you. You said a lot of the species extinction is the species which are very low. That doesn't change my point. Okay, if the cause of extinction of 1 million different localities and species is a global phenomenon like climate change, you have to deal with the cause, namely climate change.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter if the result is local extinctions. So
yeah, so well, this is a different issue, right? Though it's not about like conservation, is like more. I mean, of course, the fact that species are getting extinct is also a consequence of climate change, but it's also a consequence of overhunting, of
there are many causes.
many causes. And I don't think my account says anything about that. The only thing I say about climate change is that normally the success of a conservation action is connected to its potential to mitigate climate change. And so it looks like there's a lot that hinges on conservation action to be successful according to the standards that we have seen earlier, such that it looks like, yeah, if we do not apply those conservation actions, we're also going to be responsible for not having done everything we could to mitigate climate change, which I think this like makes it worse, because it, instead of like helping you like think about the criteria in conservation itself, urges you to just take action, because otherwise you're gonna be found responsible for not having done anything against climate change. So I think the two issues are conceptually distinct. We can analyze them differently, and I don't wanna like take a stance on the global character of climate change.
I'm Asia Watkins. I'm a grad student in the philosophy department here. That's what I did myself better. Okay, I have a question that is, I think it's like kind of just out of curiosity, but also might help you articulate something that I think you went over a little quickly. And it has to do with the global graph thing that the global the red dots.
Yeah.
Map. I guess I'm just asking if you could say more about like how it is assessed that a particular location is good for purposes of conservation, like what it is that means good for, like, does it have to do with the potential to host a bunch of species? Does it have to do with where humans are or aren't? Is it climatic conditions? Is like what are the things that go into that? And then the reason why I think this might be helpful for you to articulate is because it seems like we could also do a critical metrology sort of analysis of that in exactly the way that you're saying. And I'm just wondering like what it is.
Yeah, sure, thanks. So I want to say, like, according to that paper, they make a trade-off among three different criteria of why to prioritize. Like, if the question is like, why shall we prioritize the red spots? The answer is because if we establish protected area in those spots, there are three benefits we're going to have. The first benefit is we are going to avoid species extinction. Indeed, those like red spots mostly overlap with what's called biodiversity hotspots, which is already a concept that has been like quite criticized. The second criterion is like how that spot, for example, just because of its like, I don't know, like its diversity, is able or might contribute to the mitigation of climate change. And the third one is if we have good reason to think that that's a good investment. For example, if there are good like reason to think that it's doable to protect that area. And clearly there are both geographic and socio-political reasons why you might not want to do that. And there are trade-offs. So sometimes like these three criteria might be at odds. You might have like a place that is like that scores very high about like how many species there are, but is like subject to war. So it's less likely that if you try to protect it, you're gonna be successful. And the red spot have been assigned based on a trade-off among the three criteria. And of course, there is like some critical metrology to do because, for example, the cost-benefit analysis is all about social, ethnic, cultural factors.
I'll take more questions. Yes.
Hey, Federica, I'm Matt, also a grad student in philosophy here. I really loved your presentation. I really agree with your main claims. One thing I'm wondering about though is it might be very hard to quantify or operationalize cultural and ethnic diversity. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about that, or if that's just something that might come later down the line in your project.
Yeah, no, I think this is a central problem to address, and I don't think it should be us who even decides what's cultural and ethnic diversity. I that has to be discussed with communities that are also traditionally excluded from the conceptualization of biodiversity, including ethnic and cultural diversity itself. So it is something that is still in progress. And I think in order to have a better sense, and I'm not against quantification, I'm only against using a pre-established concept of ethnic and cultural diversity, one that comes from traditional reflections on what exactly counts as cultural and ethnic diversity. So we should include more people also in the discussion of how to conceptualize, and once we have conceptualized it, how to quantify those diversities.
Mostly following student in the philosophy department. Just general question I'm super clear about. Sort of on the perhaps in the purpose of these sort of reflections. Who are they addressed too? Like, is this, like, is what you're talking about, like, sort of as a political slash economic proposal, you could theoretically present at whatever world meeting of NGOs or whatever, or is this, what is this should? We should, you know, measure things in this way or not measure things in that way, but it's sort of an abstract should for whom?
Yeah, so it's the critical metrology literature. What is it about? Critical metrology is about, like, you know, like revealing how metrics are constructed and who applies metrics. Basically everyone, social scientists, natural scientists, physicists, and reflecting on this means to overlap your research to the one that is done by science practitioners. But since conservation, just like climate change, are social political issues besides being scientific issues, and require policy making, the type of critical metrology I'm doing, the analysis I'm doing, can also be addressed to that, especially raising awareness in policymakers that the metrics they sometimes take for granted, because policymakers are not necessarily trained scientists. They also have to be careful about which metrics they select, because those metrics are not neutral. As Adrian said, like pure, you said nicely, like innocent. They're not innocent. They bring about certain values. And so, yeah, I think this type of analysis, a critical metrology analysis, which is not just about conservation, it can be done in medicine, it can be done in climate change, it can be done in economics, addresses, the people that are potentially involved, or that can potentially, they should pay attention to these types of analysis, are both practicing scientists and policymakers and other philosophers, of course.
So I guess this idea of, this is just for me to get down what sort of philosophy is, I guess. So the idea of like a philosophy that influences practicing science,
yes,
which in turn influences, you know, policy making.
Yeah.
Sort of.
Yeah. So philosophy of science today, this is what it does. It does not only like makes armchair arguments, but it also tries to influence and engage with the scientists and the way they practice.
We had another question here, and then I've seen that Adrian also has the hand raised.
I'm Adrian, also a philosophy grad student. I wanted to ask about, okay, so let me try to be as clear as possible. So in your proposal with critical metrology, we're supposed to take into account human well-being, including things like cultural and ethnic diversity. And then we sort of like compare or put that together with sort of non-human animal well-being, right, for conservation. So I'm trying to figure out how we're supposed to prioritize the well-being of one person versus the well-being of an animal when we're coming up with these metrics, especially because it seems to me that it has the potential to then become anthropocentric, where we're just focusing on humans and not valuing animals in the same way that we value a human life. So I just maybe to say something about like the priority of those two.
Thanks. I think I have a similar question to the one similar answer to the one I gave to Matt. I think it's important to involve more people and more viewpoints on this. And I think, I mean, there are clearly traditions that are not anthropocentric. Like think about all the literature in Native American philosophers. They are like very clear about how the axiology they endorse is not anthropocentric, but is rather ecocentric, and they do not rely on certain basic concepts that are at core of conservation science today, which is, for example, the idea that nature has intrinsic value. Like there are viewpoints and there are axiologies that do not rely on those concepts to build up their view of and the relationship with the environment. And so I think it's important to hear all these viewpoints. And the IUCN, the CBD, they all acknowledge that. they all acknowledge that it's important. It's in their statutes. The problem is that this is hardly applied. Like, so it's like more like, you know, a facade.
Adrian.
Yeah, thanks for letting me come back. I just was thinking, I've been sitting here thinking about, Federica, your response to the is using measurements at all a colonial practice? And I thought, I agree with you that it's not, but I don't think you gave, I think you got a better answer available than one you gave. So what you said was, hey, people have used measurements throughout time, so that's fine. And that kind of answer seems kind of a little bit trite, and also it's going to overgeneralize in worrying ways. I think there's a much more interesting response. Again, I'm taking this from discussions of community archaeology, where a lot of the same sort of worries come up. Often the worry is put in terms of, like, you know, this famous line about the master's tools, right? So the master's not going to give you the tools to break their house down or whatever. And people often will interpret this in terms of the sort of intellectual resources that the master has, right? So when someone says, hey, you know, measurements or quantities are the master's tools, they're saying, oh, these are these intellectual resources the master uses. The master's tools will not help you. But that's not what it means. Master's tools are about the strategies of oppression. So when originally people are saying the master's tools will not what they're saying is the sets of strategies of oppression that they're using are not ones that we can use, right? We can't do what they do in order to overcome this oppression. But it's got nothing to do with the intellectual and material resources that the master has. So just because the master uses, you know, quantifiable measurements in their strategies of oppression doesn't mean that measurements and quantities can't be used to push back against oppression. And it seems to me that that's a sort of better answer than the one you gave.
Yeah, thank you. This is an excellent point that you're making, and I think I might incorporate it in the written version of the paper. The other like answer I had, and this is a more like pragmatic type of answer, was like resorting to Noret's boat, like that you cannot basically destroy or like rebuild a boat while you are at sea. You need to, you know, rebuild or renew like little pieces of it. Otherwise, if you like just break it apart, you end up in the water, in the ocean, like and you're gonna die. And so I think we might make a similar and analogous argument to this by saying that since our science, our funding scheme, and the vast majority of like the scientific community still relies heavily on measurements and quantification, it's going to be very hard to say just like not do it anymore. So this might be like another potential answer to that, to the worry.
Could I add something on this point? I have a similar concern, but the way I would phrase it is slightly different. We can do all the measurements we want, and this is true of not just conservation, but say economics or whatever. But ultimately, from a philosophical point of view, there are value judgments, right? There are value judgments that have to be made. Okay, so maybe a value judgment is don't let a single species go extinct. And that's perfectly justifiable. Okay, you can argue about it, value judgments, but that's different from making measurements and concocting some sort of index or something that tells you what you think it tells you is what to do. And I was going to similarly mention this in the context. You mentioned cost-benefit analysis, I think twice in your talk. I would give zero importance to cost-benefit analysis. Okay, zero. Your values have to be, we're going to ignore that kind of approach, formal approach that economists always advocate, and it's part of the colonization process, right? Economists are well known for colonizing everything in the world, they're trying to at least. So I'd be really careful about ever relying on cost-benefit analysis. You know, people tried to do that for climate change for decades, and it delayed action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, they are like the 30 by 30 people are doing all the time.
Ignore economists.
It's, yeah. I mean, when limited resources are available, there's a point where.
No.
So on this point, I have a question to ask. There is, you know, in 1990s, a group of economists, of which I am not one, I am innocent, but they came up with the field of ecosystem economics and with, you know, quantitative, you know, ways of creating kind of, commensurability models for calculating the value of ecosystem services. And this is the birth of natural infrastructure and all that. I was surprised to not hear about that in your talk, being one of the sort of maybe most important paradigm shift in conservation metrics. So I wonder if it's part of your research or if it's like in a different side, or if you're like keeping it out for.
Yes, I'm keeping it out for this talk, but you're certainly right. And there has been like some also empirical studies of the impact of the concept of ecosystem service and the fact that it is quantifiable, or like in monetary terms. There has been like some research saying that no, we have failed in like the application of that concept. So the reason why we invented it was not just because we still have this, we still entertain this thought that human beings should master nature and nature is at our disposal. That's like ecosystem service. This is where it comes from. It like conceptualizes natures in terms of resources instead of sources. And indigenous communities, philosophers who also belong to indigenous traditions that like pointed this out very clearly. I don't know whether I can incorporate it into. It's for sure a point that can find its place in the written version, and I'm definitely on board with that. But I have not thought about incorporating it in the metrics yet.
But actually, there's a very good essay just on this issue that was written by the president of the Anthropology in Berlin, the Green Party think tank. I have to edit it, but anyway, the bottom line is it's a very thoughtful essay. What the concept of ecosystem services and putting dollar values on it is ridiculous.
If there are other questions, well, can I ask a second question? I think we still have a few minutes, and I want to take advantage of Federica's presence and expertise here. So one of the places where I did ethnographic research for my book is a delta where that's also conservation, a wetland conservation area, but it's hard to talk about community there because there is not one unified community. There's municipalities, there were villages that once upon a time were municipalities, now there are districts of the city. There is an ethnic diversity. Most contemporary residents practice conventional monoculture agriculture based on hybrid seeds. They do not like it, but that's what they gotta do. They're sort of kind of stuck. And they live in a landscape of prior dispossession and resettlement. So they benefit from forced population exchange and genocide, though they're also poorer parents who were granted land or who were resettled from the areas of the former Ottoman Empire. So they're benefiting from, the kind of violence of nation state formation, but they were not perpetrators per se. So it's tricky there to talk about, community. There is definitely not the kind of same claim that indigenous communities can hold in other sites. They bear a lot of the, externalities of conservation, right? They're not allowed to use the main road, whereas visiting anthropologists or the local natural scientists can, of course, access it with their, fossil fuel emitting vehicles. However, it's kind of like a gray area, just like enormous wealth disparities and power relations, even within a whole household settlement. And so, how do you, as a philosopher, how do you account for a context which is, I think, where in a lot of the planet where the community was maybe made up for the purpose of the wetland management plan, it doesn't pre-exist that plan, and people occupy these positions where they're both victims and perpetrators, and yet they bear a lot of the kind of burdens of mostly urban residents, middle class vision of the value of wetland preservation. So give me some philosophy's tools for navigating that.
Yeah, thank you very much for pointing out that this case. I think it's very interesting. The case I were focusing on were mostly the establishment of national parks where you remove or you evict a a relatively homogeneous community. But it's definitely true that a lot of communities, especially in Turkey, I was reading your book, so I have some idea of like I have some like understanding of the type of situation you're talking about. Situations where like just for the preservation of the land itself, you need to create that community. I think it's very interesting. So like the community, you might think it has been like originated because you probably had like a scientific community and a policy community that took decision without relative independence from the population that was subject to that. I think one of the tools that philosophy is developing right now, just to rethink of the current situation, not to go back to the initial injustice, is trying to formulate some sort of democratizing science. And the projects of democratizing science, I'm very interested in this, are mostly rely on the idea that like natural environments have been shaped by humans. There are value judgment in every decision we take, whether scientific or not. And so the best direction we can take is to involve the population that are going to be subjected to certain policies. If we want to do those policies, we cannot like take decisions without involving the population. And even if the population is heterogeneous, this does not discount the fact that representative from each of the communities have to be called for. And so, yeah, I would have this like participatory idea, this participatory paradigm that should substitute the this top-down form of decision-making as for nature management. And I think this is going to be like quite a big topic in philosophy of science in the next few years. There has been some research done, especially in participatory science, when medical issues were coming up, or epidemiological like questions to solve in a community. There has not been done much in conservation on the behalf of philosophers. So thanks for also suggesting to take this into account.
Well, what a wonderful event. Thank you so much, Federica, for your presentation and response. And thank you, Adrian, for your response and commentary throughout. And thank you all for your participation and questions. Let's give a round of applause.